do a presentation, and we'll hold for questions until the end. I have a couple of questions, but then I can also open it up. Yeah, for you, I have, how do you find and catch a unicorn? How do you find and catch a unicorn? And how do you find the right balance between having them do purely coding versus purely journalism? Or is there such a thing as purely one of each?
You have a unicorn. Oh boy.
Do you have multiple unicorns?
Yes.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Oh, wow. I'm Garrett Goodman. Thanks all for coming. Thanks to everybody for experiencing this amazing day with us here. I think that we got very lucky with the weather. If anybody was here last year, you remember it wasn't quite this nice. So if it's your first year, enjoy it. Thanks to Chris and Ariana for having us. And I'll start by introducing the panel. Then we'll go through some quick presentations. We'll hold the questions until the end. And then we'll have the questions. So get ready. First of all, you should probably have an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about unicorns. It's in the title of the panel. We kind of have defined unicorns as these rare magical creatures that live in the newsroom at the intersection of coding and journalism. So we have a pretty impressive panel here. To my left, we have Jackie Mayer, who is a real-life unicorn. She is an interactive journalist at the BBC. She was on Aaron Pilhofer's team at the New York Times. She's going to tell us a little bit about her journey, her path to where she is now at the BBC, what it takes to be a unicorn today, and also what that means in the newsroom. And then next to her, we have Aaron Pilhofer, who was formerly of the New York Times and is now executive editor of digital at The Guardian. If you look at the media organizations where he's worked at, you can see they're pretty much leading in the digital space. And then you look at the roles that he had at these news organizations, you can see that he was pretty much at the cutting edge of the cutting edge. So he's going to show us some of his favorite projects in the interactive space and tell us a bit about what it takes to build that kind of team. And then we have John Crowley, who's the digital editor for Europe at the Wall Street Journal. And John is going to take us through some of these beautiful immersive stories that they've put together with video, interactive graphics, photos, and also give us an idea of kind of the editorial culture around unicorns and how that has evolved. So I think we'll start with Jackie, if you're ready.
Sure. How do I switch over?
Can we put it on Jackie's computer?
Bear with us a second. Do I have to do something?
Any questions so far?
Yeah. So while we're waiting, I can just start. So I thought that you might be interested in how I got to be an interactive journalist at the BBC. My story, like all good stories, I think, starts in Queens, New York. That's where I'm from, and I grew up there. Growing up, I wanted to be a writer. Specifically, I wanted to be a poet. Oh, there we go. Good. So anyway, as all good stories, they start in Queens. How does a unicorn come into being? So I wanted to be a poet. Thankfully, before I even got to college, I ended up falling in with a bunch of hackers in New York, going to 2600 magazine meetings and things like that, which was good because poets don't really make that much money. Not really a sustainable thing to get into. But I got into hacking, and that's intentionally silly. But I got into the hacker scene because, well, they had mohawks and they looked pretty cool, and I was 15. But also because of some of the things that they believed in and talked about whether it was government surveillance or even the ways that they figured things out. They would just dive in, and I found that attractive. Moving along, though, I ended up falling into a job in technology, and this was in the mid-90s. Pretty soon after that, I heard that the Hearst Corporation, the publisher of magazines like Esquire and newspapers like the San Francisco Chronicle, was starting an experiment called the Interactive Studios. And the Interactive Studios started in, I guess, 98 or 99. I joined in 1999, and it was a really early endeavor into mixing technology and journalism. And I ended up working there for a few years. What did I do there? I built a CMS for popular mechanics, because I guess if you know some technology and are in this world, you're going to build a CMS at some point. I made lots of quizzes, interactive quizzes for Cosmo. Not that one in particular, but that gives you the idea. My favorite project was making an interactive searchable drinks database for Esquire. But lots of things happened. It was probably too early, one might argue. Hearst shut down its interactive studios, and I was wondering, what do I do? So I went west, I went to California, I ended up working for startups. I won't go too far into that, but I was one of the lead engineers at Friendster, which you guys all look way too young to remember, but it was an early social media networking website. And I found that interesting because it let me apply technology to a problem, finding friends, I guess. Then I went on to Live Nation, and I built ticketing systems for them, helping people see their favorite bands. Moved on back to New York, navigating the real estate market there with Street Easy. And then I went to Africa. Africa doesn't really fit in with that, so a brief sojourn, if I may. I ended up getting involved with this non-profit, non-governmental organization called Baobab. And Baobab is named after the tree, the Baobab tree. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a crazy tree that has lots of myths and legends around it. But the whole point of the NGO was to help clinicians in the field better help patients, specifically with antiretroviral treatment, so patients with HIV. The problem in the country that they were based, Malawi, where I also went and worked, was that there were long lines, very few doctors, and all sorts of errors could happen when you're trying to process as many people at the same time. So I worked at the hospital there in the capital. One thing I didn't mention, I just realized, is that after the interactive studios at Hearst got shut down, I went back to school and I studied epidemiology. So this was a natural, kind of place for me to go when the journalism technology thing in the late 90s didn't work out. These are all pictures that I took while I was there. But moving right along, after I spent time in Africa, I ended up coming back to New York, and I had a friend who had started a job the previous year on a new team at the New York Times, a paper that I grew up reading. And that team was headed by Aaron Pillhofer over here. I went in for an interview, and I was very excited. And I don't know, there were some things that happened. There was like a...
You got hired.
I got hired a year later. In the meantime, I ended up meeting this fellow, Dave Cohn, who started Spot Us, which was a endeavor to do crowdfunding for journalism. And I worked on that with him, and I helped him develop that. Then I got hired at the New York Times, and that was an amazing experience to just walk through the newsroom there. At the New York Times, one of my first projects that I got to work on, thanks to a quick phone call with my boss, was after the horrible earthquake that happened in Haiti. We discovered that people were actually sending in questions about where their loved ones were. And we had this photo submission form tool that we realized that we could repurpose to let people actually send in details of like who in their family was missing. And we ended up making this interactive that you can see up on the screen. And it turned into a collaboration between Google and the Red Cross, and it was a really rewarding project. The biggest project you knew this was going to come up. The biggest project I worked on there was several Olympics, in particular the London Olympics. We built this, it was the editorial and technological feat of a project, processing all of this data. It was intense. That's me and my former coworker with Wenlock, who's a little bit of a creepy one-eyed guy. But anyway, working in a newsroom environment compared to a startup or even public health was incredibly rewarding. What do you call what unicorns do? I'm sure that's what we're going to talk about. This is from inside the New York Times. Database reporting is one name for it. While I love the New York Times, after about 5 years, things happen. I fell in love with someone in London. I wanted to move to London. I also wanted to get a new experience. And I ended up at the BBC because broadcast media is not something that I've worked in before, and I thought it would be really interesting. And the BBC, I think in some ways they're kind of a technical organization from the beginning, maybe because of their start in radio. I'm not sure. That's me with a robotic camera there. Some of the things that I'm working on at the BBC are surrounding linked data and what its applications can do. So what can you do if you have good structured data on all of your reporting? You can have dashboards, you can have things that check out like how is our coverage balanced for things like the election, the upcoming election in the UK. And we can make dashboards because everyone loves dashboards, showing things, the balance of our coverage. And also experimenting with storytelling. This is going to be published probably next week. Sneak peek. And let's see. I feel like I've talked a whole lot. And we can get into maybe the unicorn thing, and I can get into what this book's about.
Sure. Aaron, when you're done tweeting.
Sorry. Dinner reservations.
All right. Should we go over?
Are
you ready?
No, I'm good. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Let's plug you in.
Thanks. So I don't have actually. I'm going to show you the three most recent projects that we have been working on, because I think they actually. Boom. I knew that was coming. Let's go up here. Okay. So I'm actually going to show you the three most recent projects we've been working on, and I'm going to show you those in a moment. It's okay. I don't need it up there yet. I'll talk about that in a second. So my journey was a bit different than Jackie's. I was actually coming from a very traditional background, print journalism. But as I have said and like to say, I was always kind of on the nerd wing of the print journalism world. My sort of background is data analysis, data journalism of a sort. And that's also probably worth mentioning here, that there are many, many, many flavors of this kind of work. And actually, it's nothing particularly new. Using data as a source, bringing data into reporting, finding ways to make data part of the story. This has been going on in the States for almost 50 years. And in various ways, going back to people like Phil Meyer or Bartlett and Steele, who were doing this work with punch cards, stealing time on a mainframe at wee hours at universities. And so, this is kind of a tradition that has been going on and growing and changing for a long time. And so I think what's new, though, is a few things. What you're starting to see is the ability to not just use data in a way, as a means to tell a story in a traditional sense or a traditional format, like an inverted pyramid style, newspaper story or a traditional print or broadcast story. You're starting to see and have been seeing completely different news story forms emerging, and that's the kind of thing that Jackie has been working on at the BBC in particular, and she can talk about that, I hope. We did some of that at the Times and other newsrooms, and at the Guardian also. So you're starting to see I think now data journalism emerging in a sense, in its own right, as a form of journalism, as a standing form of journalism. And if you are a reader of many of the explanatory journalism sites out there, the 538s, the Vox.coms, the one that I think does the best job, and I know I sound partisan when I say this, is the New York Times' Upshot site. And I would invite you to go check out what they're doing, not just in text, but also in graphics, because I would say some of the most powerful work they do is purely in graphical form. And some of the best storytelling they do is in purely graphical form, in an interactive form. And so that's, to me, what the real power is and what's really changed. Part and parcel, then, is if you want to tell those kinds of stories, you have to have people in a storytelling capacity who are both journalists but also capable of producing this kind of work. And that means changing the definition of who a journalist is and bringing new kinds of skills into the newsroom. And so Jackie was part of that at the New York Times. I was part of that at the New York Times in a previous iteration when the Times brought a bunch of people who do the work that I do into the newsroom. There was a similar debate about whether, now we talk about our programmers, journalists. Well, there was a time, and in some, I would say, less informed quarters of the profession still is a time, where you're having this conversation about just about anyone who works with numbers, So that's kind of what we're seeing is to me that this is the next sort of iteration of a continuum that's been going on for a while. And so why I'm showing you these three pieces, one of which has not yet been published, I might add, is that I think it shows exactly why and what we're trying to accomplish and why. So this looks pretty straightforward, right? This is just a piece we published, this was March 24th. Immigration, obviously a huge issue in the UK. It's a piece where the sides of the debate tend to be, the loudest discussants tend to be the politicians, tend to come from the polls. You rarely hear voices of immigrants themselves. And we wanted to do something that brings those voices into the discussion. This wasn't, by the way, this came to us from a couple of really amazing journalists on the comment side. Rosie Swash was the editor who ran this. And what she wanted to do was produce a piece of journalism that was made of the voices of immigrants, and not reported through journalists. And so we've done this kind of thing before. I mean, this is, the Times, we produced lots and lots of these kinds of pieces where there might be an image and there might be a story that goes with that, and you might want to click through, read the story, and it just becomes this kind of beautiful sort of combination of text and imagery, but created entirely by readers, edited by us, selected by us, but created entirely by readers. And so this looks very simple, but it's actually, there's a lot going on in the back here. This is a template. This is something that we can use over and over and over again, and we don't have to lay out what you see up there by hand. You can see some of the images are portraits, some are landscape, some are this wide, some are that wide, but they all kind of line up. How does that happen? That is not unicorn magic. That's a technology problem, right? But in service of a storytelling end, a journalistic end. Why do we have some that are text? Well, some have images, some don't. How do we address that? That's a style problem. That's also a technology problem. But again, toward a journalistic end. And so this is a device, now we built this for this project, but this is a template that we can use over and over and over again for these kinds of journalism projects. It's nothing fancy, it's nothing complicated, but I'll tell you, if you don't have people in your newsroom who can look at an API look at something and say, how do we solve this problem? How do we create something where we take the photos and we can see, oh, this is a landscape, that's a portrait, we have room for this many. How do we lay them all out and get them all in there so everything lines up and it looks right? Well, then it is a problem that's almost unsolvable, right? Then it is magic. This is our polling projection. This is kind of our all things polling page for the Guardian for the current election. And here, you can see pretty much everything you want to know. The goal here wasn't to just produce, actually this. At the bottom is the thing that we were least interested in doing, which is just a sort of a daily kind of, here's the latest poll, here's the second latest poll, and on and on and on, just this long list of polls. Because people just get overwhelmed with this stuff. I know I do. You see poll after poll after poll, one's up, next day they're down, next day they're up again. What does it all mean? Well, that's why we wanted to start with this. We wanted to start with, what does it actually mean? If the election were held today based on an average of polls, what is the likely makeup of Parliament? What would it be? And so that changes. We wanted to show some sort of a change. And so you can see that here, these little spark lines, which are kind of nice. So you can see over time how that's gone up and down. It gives you a sense of sort of the longitudinal story. And here you can see, again, kind of graphically represented the poll of polls with the rolling average going across. And this is important because it helps readers in a couple of different ways. Oh, and then most importantly, you can see, fine, so party X is up, party Y is down, but what does that actually mean? You can't just tell you they're up or down. It's a zero-sum game. So gains from one party means losses from another. So where is Labor gaining? Where are Conservatives gaining? These are two different things. So here you can see Labor is gaining primarily from Lib Dems, but mostly from the Conservatives, which is important. Here, the Conservatives are gaining where they are gaining. They're only gaining from Lib Dems, who are currently part of their coalition. So the difference there is pretty key. That means that since they're already a coalition with Lib Dems, that means it's effectively not a gain at all, in a sense, and whereas this is. And we wanted to sort of, ooh, sorry about that. I'm not a pro. We wanted to kind of show that in a graphical way to provide that kind of context for readers. So this is the sort of thing, and it looks beautiful and it looks amazing and all that, but if you don't have people on staff who can think through this problem and show this in a way that takes something that we think we all understand, we all think we understand what a poll is and what it means, but we really don't, because a single poll is sort of not really the relevant. What's relevant is sort of the aggregate. What is directionally what's going on? And that is the most important thing to show people. So here, again, it's a technology problem, it's a design problem, but it's also a journalistic problem. It's taking data and turning it into meaning and context, which is in fact what journalists do. And then finally, this is the piece that hasn't been published yet. It's still very much kind of a work in progress. We wanted to take that and apply the same methodology geographically, because that's also important. Here you're seeing the poll, what's likely to come. This is a constituency level map, so you can see constituency by, and it's obviously it's a cartogram. It's not a geographically accurate. It's representative but not geographically accurate, where every constituency is the same size. You can see it just sort of looks like the UK has a little bit of a weight problem, because London is, obviously the center of population there. But here you can see just dramatically where the S&P in Scotland is looking to gain. All of those gains, by the way, and here you can see that, all the gains that they're making in Scotland are coming at the expense of Labour. And you can just see that as plain as day. And here again, in the north, you can see these are constituencies, again, where this is sort of the story I was showing you earlier, but now it's represented geographically, where you're seeing one constituency here nightly turning into a Labour, at least based on the polling. So this, again, provides the context, provides the background. It gives readers a way of understanding something that we think we all understand, but actually is very complicated. And these are the kinds of things that the people with these kind of skills can do. And if your newsroom doesn't have them, then, like I said, then it does become more a question of magic than of actual journalism and storytelling, which is really what it's all about.
Thank you. So unicorns don't actually think they're unicorns. It's just everybody else who thinks they're unicorns.
Yes.
Is that it?
Pretty much, right?
Yes.
Not yet.
While we're getting set up, Jackie, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
What is the difference between working in the interactive team at a place that has a print legacy versus a broadcast legacy, or is there a difference?
I'm not sure if there's an explicit difference just because of having a print legacy versus a broadcast media legacy. So far in my experience, and I've only been at my current job with the BBC for 3 months, but in my experience, if you have a legacy, you're going to have a legacy, whether it's television, radio, or print. And if you're held, held back in some way by the legacy system, whether or not you are intending to keep continuing with it, you're going to be held back. So there are differences between, at least in my experience, between an organization like the BBC and some of the newspapers or magazines or print media that I've worked at. And I don't know if this is unique to the BBC or not, but so far it seems that people are, the people I work with, whatever their actual role is, are a lot more comfortable with technology. And that might be, or at least more comfortable than some of the people when I first started working in print media were comfortable with tech. And my guess is that it's because organization like the BBC, it has always been a bit of an engineering sort of technology company. It's innovated with radio and television all the way through. So, and I'm hoping that they'll continue doing that in the digital space.
Hopefully you're helping too.
Well, we'll see.
John, let's go over to you. I know you guys have done some really beautiful work, and I'm excited to have you show it to us and also talk us through it. So go ahead.
Sure, thank you. Like many of you in here, I've started out from a print background. I've been at the Wall Street Journal for 4 years now in London. That was 2 years after kind of the digital hub in Europe was founded, so we're a little bit behind kind of our American colleagues in New York about kind of the projects that we're trying to do. But what we found over the last 18 months working with so-called unicorns, there's amazing kind of things that we can achieve. Only last year we had kind of one coder basically in London. We now have 3 because we've realized how important it is to kind of bring more on board. And there's another person who's undergoing a transformation into a unicorn as well. So we will soon have 4. The question I wanted to pose to people is over the last 6 months, the biggest stories of the last 6 months, what's the most memorable thing that you can recall from it? Charlie Hebdo, for me, the most memorable, it was an awful thing, but the most memorable thing that I can recall was the execution of the Muslim police officer, Ahmed Merabit, which was captured on video and uploaded to Facebook. He kind of gave his life protecting an organization that ridiculed his religion. That was the strongest thing for me. No one had heard of Adnan Syed until 6 months ago. How did that come about? That came through a podcast. The most memorable thing is, it wasn't a text article that I read about that in. The most memorable thing for me is Sarah Koenig's voice inside my head, basically. We talk about dwell time, on articles. Well, that was a dwell time of about 10 hours on a story. So, if only we could have that. There's one story that came out last week that I think kind of captures that transition that we're undergoing at the moment from kind of text-based storytelling to something that's more visual, to something that's more digital, that's something that's more interactive. And the BBC, they published this interactive on a Syrian journey. Basically, they asked you to go in the footsteps. Imagine yourself being a refugee from Syria and that you were trying to make your way to Europe, either going by land or by sea, and you had to make a series of options. You were trying to kind of take your family there. And there's a series of scenarios that were played out. And one of those scenarios, or several of those scenarios, I should say, was actually you die because you don't make it. And it was actually, in my personal view, it was very sensitively done by the BBC. I learnt a lot about the story by going through these scenarios. But of course, Fleet Street being Fleet Street, there was a row that was whipped up about it in the Sun and the Mail, saying that there was this sickening game, kind of ends with migrants drowning in the Mediterranean, and the BBC, as ever, was slammed for turning the suffering of millions into a children's game. Okay, and there was a response actually in the Guardian. There was this quote that really struck me from Janet Jones. She's a professor in journalism at the London South Bank University, and she said, the idea that in the future news will be played rather than read is quite hard for some people to think about. And as I was saying, I think we're right in the middle of that transition where people's consuming habits are kind of, in terms of news or in terms of entertainment, are changing before our eyes, and that can be quite uncomfortable for some people. But when you think in terms of gaming, I looked at a report by the Internet Advertising Bureau, and they did a survey of 4,000 people in the UK, and 69% of respondents considered themselves as gamers. And of course, this isn't kind of teenage kids in their room playing on their consoles. These are people, on their mobiles playing games as they go in on their daily commute. And I always kind of, when you're thinking about ask who are your competitors, it's actually people playing games on the train that I find rather worryingly are kind of playing that rather than kind of reading news stories. So what does that mean? So we have these so-called unicorns in the newsroom. They can deliver all this for us, right? Well, it's not quite as simple as that, which I'm going to try and explain now. And I think certainly when I started at the Journal, there were, I'm not saying these attitudes were completely prevalent there, but I think they were kind of dismissively seen as a little bit as an offshoot, the graphics interactives teams. And while I say this, I think this applies across the industry as well. There was this kind of notion that was, oh, hey, let's do a graphic, right at the end of the discussion. So, you've done the story and then, oh, let's crunch a graphic in. And, that didn't work at all. What we need to do, and what we started trying to do at the Journal, is put, coders, unicorns, call them what you want, right at the center of the conversation. But they also need to demand to be at the top table too, and just say, I need to be involved in the story right from the start, right from the very beginning. I think, coders are obviously good at coding, but I think what perhaps coders are not so good at is doing a bit of internal PR and just shouting from the rooftops and even being a bit shrill sometimes about, some of the projects that they're doing. We are lucky enough at the Journal to have interactive teams in Hong Kong, in London and New York. And, very often they're kind of producing this great content, but they're not actually telling people about it. So, what I asked people to do, this may sound very simple, but it's just to send out a bloody email just telling people, what they've done, explaining what it is, just giving you the URL, giving more coding information on a link, some social suggestions, and a social promo, just to say, hey, look, this is what we're doing, guys, yeah? At the Journal in New York, we are now going to be bringing in technologists, and we're also going to be bringing in coders over the next few months to actually work in the newsroom. And I thought what was quite interesting from the email that was sent out, there was this notion that they are going to be working with us, and there was still a little bit of a kind of a them and us thing that was kind of going on. And when I read the email, it reminded me of about 10 years ago, I was working at the Daily Telegraph on the newspaper news desk. And we got this announcement that somebody from the internet was about to join us on the news desk and work alongside us. And one hoary-assed old newsman said, what can we learn about news from somebody from the internet? And of course, times have changed, but I think there's still that kind of sense I wouldn't say of an ease. I think people have seen the bigger picture, but, you know, we do write in a different language, you know, literally. There's a coding language and there's a language that journalists don't understand. So what do you do? I mean, I think Garrett's going to possibly ask me about this afterwards. Where do you, you know, what's the natural habitat for a unicorn? Where do you find them? So, you know, you look to journalism schools, and I think traditionally they've been good at kind of teaching you how to write and to edit video, and I think they're getting better, but I think there's a bit of a catch-up being played there. There's not such a long tradition in coding there. And also that kind of notion that the, you know, data visualization doesn't fit in with the traditional newsroom model, you know, going back to, you know, coders perhaps being shy about saying what good work they are doing. Traditional newsroom reporters, you know, they speak in kind of scoops and exclusives. You know, we need to kind of find a way to integrate unicorns into the newsroom a lot better. So our sister organisation, The Times, recently held a hack day called Build the News, which it's the third event that it's held, where they invite lesser spotted unicorns to all come together and kind of build some groovy newsroom tools. And there was around about 100 unicorns there. It was kind of a really strange occurrence. They're all there in one place at one time. And here's a picture of the Wall Street Journal team, myself amongst them, trying to build kind of just a very simple newsroom tool. And what we decided to do was we called this kind of a jargon buster, which is basically you can insert definitions of technical terms into the CMS. Hopefully this will stop buffering, but you see here, it's kind of like a frictionless experience basically, where you click on a term and you find out a little bit more about it. So instead of kind of jumping out and going onto Google, you can just see it there. We've sold this to our kind of innovation director yesterday, and he responded to us and he says, yeah, we want to push ahead with this. So he's going to do it. As I said, not reinventing the wheel, but something very simple that you can bring into our CMS. One of our unicorns, who's actually taken the logo as well for his meetup, he's formed a group called Journal Coders, and they've held about 3 or 4 meetups, and the last meetup was at the BBC, where they were just showing journalists who were interested, you know, what is an API about, and you know, they did one-on-ones with people and just took them through it, which I thought was very good. Let me take you through now some of the work that our people have done over the last 18 months. This interactive was about a Greek rapper called Pavlos Fyssas, who was stabbed to death by Golden Dawn, right-wing Golden Dawn activists. You just go through. Our reporter was handed this kind of illegible police kind of chart of the phone calls and texts that took place on the night of his murder. And basically these were calls from the hierarchy from Golden Dawn, just giving the green light for the murder to happen. As you can see, I mean, you can't make head nor tail of this, and neither could the reporter. And Jovi Juan, our graphics director, who'd recently just started, just said, well, look, send me all the details over, and I'll have a look at it. And what he managed to do was build in Illustrator just a timeline of the phone calls that took place in the night. You see the white line denotes the time of his death at 12:13, where he was fatally stabbed, but you see the yellow lines denoting the calls that took place between the main assailants. And what was revolutionary for us, certainly in London, was that the data viz was a starting point for us. We wouldn't have had a story without it. That was the story. So we wrote a text story off the back of it, but we built an interactive where we built a narrative in terms of slideshows, in terms of video, explaining who Golden Dawn was, how they polled. You know, recently this year they came 3rd in the Greek elections, so they're not just a fringe organisation. So emboldened by this, we decided to look at kind of other projects that we could turn our gaze onto. And last year was the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I. And rather stupidly, we thought, let's do 100 legacies from World War I. That will be easy, won't it? And it was a 6-month undertaking, which I worked on a team with about 8 people, which kind of drove us slightly bonkers, but we're very proud of what we came out with. This was built on a JavaScript library called Isotope. It's basically, it's in a kind of a card format. And behind all these pictures are 44,000 words. It's a kind of a small novel, but you wouldn't get that from looking at it. We atomized the content. So I'm just going to play a little bit of some of the stuff we did. We covered everything from Dadaism to I've had a mind blank, but we've covered everything. Countries that were kind of formed from it, old empires that fell, kind of breakthroughs in literature and culture, and you could vote for it as well. And here's a video that we did.
The First World War made Hitler possible. The First World War gave him a purpose, an aim, a commitment, and subsequently a mission. A picture of him on the very first day when the German declaration.
So that was a 5-minute interview that we ran with Hitler's biographer, Sir Ian Kershaw. Here's another example of what we did, which is a slider where you can actually interact with the screen. This is on code breaking, where obviously to the left you have the code, you swipe to the left and you find what it's read about. As you can see, you can share each item. Here's one of a man modeling a helmet who was just told to move from left to right. And then he goes to the right. Cool, hey? So, we did about 50 different kind of interactives for this. It's won a couple of awards. We're very proud of it. We also made a virtue of asking people to tell us what we'd missed, because we knew we were going to miss something. And then we published them. And so what we did, we made sure that, having spent 6 months on this, we didn't kind of throw everything that we did away. We decided to repurpose this and use it on other different formats. In this case, remember the death from Robin Williams? Everybody was kind of searching YouTube for clips from his films, his dramas, TV, his stand-up. We just embedded a load of YouTube clips and put them all together in one place. Here's another example that we did, which is more core to the Wall Street Journal. This is a business story about the LIBOR scandal, which is basically the fiddling of the interbank loan rate by traders all around the world. $5 billion in fines have been levied on banks and institutions for what they did. And the numbers of people and institutions involved were myriad. It was a kind of a spider's web. So, hey, we decided to create basically a spider's web on it, basically, where you could click on each individual organization and see how they were connected to it. This is built on D3, Mike Bostock's D3, which you guys obviously recognize. But again, you can manipulate the graphic yourself. You talk about reader engagement, you can kind of drag it across the screen. And if you bank with RBS, you don't know how therapeutic it is dragging RBS across the screen. Moving on, here's something more kind of diurnal. We didn't have basically a map graphic that kind of did us justice, and one of our unicorns, Mr. Elliot Bentley again, decided to design a new map. And this is a map that I built in 60 seconds, basically. And I think that's important too, that you have unicorns who are kind of building all these big kind of interactive graphics, but there's also kind of tools that they can build that can be rolled out to the newsroom that everyone can use. So you're not always going up to the desk and going, hey, can you create something? I don't know how to do it. So this is, it's a really simple piece of work. I think, it's built on the front. It drags in pictures from Leaflet, and I think there's a lovely kind of back end which is really simple that even dunces like me can use. Here's something that we published yesterday on the UK election. We're talking about gamifying, trying to get people to interact with things. Here you can kind of choose a party and see how they match up with kind of a partner, the Conservatives and SNP. That is not going to happen, clearly. But Labour and SNP, hey, there's more of a possibility that it can happen. And this is kind of aimed at our kind of American cousins, trying to demystify the election coalition shake-up that's going to happen. So in terms of takeaways, I mean, what works for us? Well, matrix management, getting journalists, like in the case with Marcus Walker, who worked on the Golden Dawn thing, he had the knowledge in his head. He didn't know how to display it. It's just linking him up with somebody who can kind of unlock it. We haven't kind of touched on the issue of whether journalists should learn to code. I mean, you know, I think what they should be doing, journalists who can't code should be thinking first, what is the best way to tell this story? Is it a visual? Is it a video? Is it, you know, some piece of data? And I think that's kind of half the battle. And going back to, you know, the thing of them and us, the more that, you know, journalists collaborate in the newsroom with unicorns, you know, before long there won't be a them and us, there will just be an us. Thank you.
I think what you said at the end there was very interesting. You touched on this fact that actually unicorns are not, call them what you want, but we'll call them unicorns for the panel, are not only building things that are external, you know, facing the reader, but also they're building tools to empower the newsroom, to empower journalists to tell their stories in new ways. So Jackie, just because you are our resident unicorn today, how much do you do internal tools, and how much are you building these kind of immersive, interactive experiences? You know, what's the split like?
I think, well, for me, it varies all the time, and I'm sure that would be true for other people in this line of work. Currently, most of my work, I'd say, is internal facing, not in the realm of storytelling. I have one project that is digital visual storytelling that will be published like pretty soon, probably next week. But for the most part, I find it more. I actually, in many ways, find it more exciting to work on tools for investigative journalism, and I think it's a pretty underserved, at least by technology, field, and there's a lot of opportunity there. So yeah, most of my stuff is internal.
So when we were talking before the panel, you had, when we met up in London, you mentioned that you sort of fell into coding, that it wasn't really a passion that brought you there, and you touched on that also today. I think it's interesting to note that, because I think that there's a perception that the unicorns have to be super passionate about coding, and that has to be what they love to do. And I thought that was worth highlighting, that actually that wasn't the case for you, right?
I mean, I love what you can do with code or design, right? I'm not the kind of person who just likes to hack on algorithms and make them run faster or whatever, unless there's an actual specific need for it. Yeah, I mean, I think you can come, I don't know, I've been working in and around technology for 20 years at this point, and people come into it from all different backgrounds and different journeys. Yeah, you don't have to, I don't personally think you have to have a hardcore computer science degree to do it.
John, actually both you and Aaron mentioned the fact that you're building things in a sort of template mode, right? Things that can be reused. You were at the time of Snowfall, right? How much of that was reusable?
Oh, God, I don't know. It's hard to say. I would guess very little. To be clear, my team had nothing to do with Snowfall at all. I always have to say that as a standard disclaimer. But I would guess not a ton. But that's actually the pattern, you know, more broadly, that's actually the better pattern, is to do something completely bespoke the first time. Hack is never a four-letter word in my world. And then if it's something that is really successful, you know, depending on what your definition of success is, which is probably a whole nother panel, then and only then do you turn it into a template. What I showed you there is the rare exception. And the only reason I know the only reason we did that as a template right out of the gate is that we had gone through that entire pattern already at the NYT and had developed templates. We did bespoke things, kind of like the Haiti example that Jackie showed. We had done a bunch of bespoke ones and then turned it into a template eventually.
John, I was going to ask you, how do you find and catch a unicorn, but you kind of already talked about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, the unicorn has to come to you, doesn't it? You can't capture it. That's my limited mythological understanding of unicorns. You've got to have, and maybe Jackie can better answer this, but they've got to kind of want to do...
No,
yeah.
I'm going to say unicorn as many times as possible.
Yeah. They've got to kind of want to do a 9-to-5 job, which not all coders want to do. And, they may want to go and work for Google and earn kind of lots of bucks. But then they've got to want to have a kind of a civic sense of kind of trying to make a difference and want to change things, yeah? And also, I suppose, I don't know, they've got to be able to handle the pressure as well. When they're working on enterprise stuff, it can, take months to kind of turn around. There may be times when, you've got to do this in a day. We want this done. So, you can't just have someone who's just a coder and just kind of bring them in. They've got to have hopefully have some kind of journalistic nous, and they've got to be the right fit. Yeah?
Yeah,
Go ahead, yeah.
I agree. And there are deadlines and pressures in technology companies like Google, for instance, like you brought up. But I found the deadlines and pressures in the news organization to be a completely different beast. And that can be scary, but it can also be an interesting problem to solve. And I think that's one way to attract people. But I totally agree that, I have a passion for news, right? And I wanted to work around news. And I don't really see what a prospective unicorn, I guess we are going to keep that going, would be doing working in a newsroom sort of environment if they didn't actually believe in the mission, right?
Okay, I've got one for any one of you three, whoever wants to answer it. But the question's about building internal tools versus open sourcing tools. Like when we talk about building tools to empower storytelling, to let journalists tell their stories in different ways, you can either open it up and allow other people to use it, or you can build it internally. Is that what's best and why? Who wants it?
Yeah, so I'll start. Anyway, so at the Times, we did a number of projects that ended up being open source. Not everything. In fact, I would say the vast majority of what we did not. And there's usually good reason for that. It just doesn't make a good open source project. It's just not something that has broad application. The Guardian, I think, just in terms of, what it is and its tradition of open journalism and all the rest is, I think actually if you were going to look at this on a continuum, I would say that Guardian sort of defaults open unless it should be closed versus defaulting closed unless it should be opened at the Times. And that's not a criticism of either approach. There's a lot of quote-unquote open source code on the Guardian's GitHub right now that hasn't been touched by a non-Guardian employee and probably never will. So, I think there are projects that have come out of newsrooms that have been really, really successful, some of which have come out of the New York Times, some of which have come out of the Guardian, some of which have come out of related organizations, but I don't know that open sourcing in and of itself is the goal. I think sharing code, sharing experiences, the map tool that you're talking about, we're working on one right now, which is ridiculous, that we're working on the exact same tool. And we're doing it because it's a problem that every newsroom faces. And so, is it going to be open source by any chance? Not to put you on the spot or anything.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Yeah? Yeah. Awesome.
I have a question for both of you. It seems to me that the tide is changing a bit as far as news organizations open sourcing. Do you feel that way? It feels like
Yeah, I mean, the first conversation I had with the lawyers at the Times about open source was what does that even mean, right? And so no, that's not. I don't mean that. I'm sorry. I don't mean that in a flippant way. But it's just this is a new thing for lawyers whose career, the whole organization, has been about protecting, copyright and protecting the very valuable content that, the organization produces and expects to be compensated for. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And so this was it took a while to have these conversations, to get to the point where there was a comfort level. But I think now we don't have those conversations anymore. So things have really, really, really changed.
Anything to add?
Well, no, I would just agree with both of them. I think default, it should be open source, but I suppose you take each instance on a case-by-case basis, yeah,
Right.
rather than have a blanket default.
Right.
Unless you guys have anything else to add, I think we'll open it up to questions, yeah? Any questions out there? Please try and get right to the question if you can. Anybody? Up here?
I have a question about like this economic sustainability of like important project, like a very complex coding project in journalism. John, I think, mentioned working with a team of 4 people for several months about a single project. Maybe the Wall Street Journal or the Guardian can afford doing such a thing, but how can smaller newspaper or big newspaper in smaller countries such as Italy really jump into this new kind of journalism when I'm not sure. I think it's very cool. I think it's the future probably, but I don't think it's really economically sustainable right now.
It's a great question.
Yeah, it's a good question. I should make it clear that the 4 of us weren't working exclusively on that for 6 months. We all had our other jobs to do, and we did a lot of it in our spare time. But yeah, some of us on this table here have the luxury of being able to kind of try out projects that don't always work. There was one that we did on the Premier League, which is basically just charting the English Premier League managers' kind of records over we were going to do it over the whole history of it since 1993, and we only did it for 5 years, and it just didn't work. It didn't work. And we were able to do that, and I do acknowledge that for smaller organizations, that's the problem. They don't have that luxury where, they can try something out and it doesn't work. The World War I thing that we worked on, I admit it, the day that it was published, I was shitting myself basically because, if it did very well, it's got over 3.5 million page views, but if it hadn't worked, I don't. What would have my bosses said to me? I think, yeah, it would have been slightly awkward. Thankfully, it did work. I mean, you know what? It's tough. I don't really have to be frank, to have an answer for that. I think you've just got to feel it and test it out. The reason why we worked in that group, I mean, we've got, the journal is lucky enough to have 1,900 journalists around the world. And, one of the strengths of the journal is that it's got 1,900 journalists. One of the weaknesses of the journal is that it's got 1,900 journalists because, they, not talking to each other and doing anything. For us, actually, it's quite relative because it actually felt quite like a small group working on it. But obviously for smaller organizations, they wouldn't have, that luxury.
So, some thoughts?
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the best parts about being on a panel with the BBC is I'm now speaking on behalf of small newsrooms. But this is a serious problem, and part of it is desire, and part of it is having buy-in at a very high level, and those are 2 things that are hard to manufacture. And if your organization doesn't have either of those 2 things, no matter what the size, you're kind of hosed, to begin with. So, but assuming you have those 2 things, but not the critical element, which is a people, which is always the hardest part, what do you do? I would say a couple of things you could think about. There are innumerable places out there now where you can get training, free, cheap, online, Code Academy, all, IRE, NICAR. I mean, you name it. There are more resources out there now, free resources, than ever before. The tools are improving by the day. When we first started doing this stuff at the NYT, 10 years ago now, it was scary because we were running servers and databases and all of this stuff to do these sort of deep dynamic things. And, I still have I twitch about this stuff, these like midnight phone calls. Oh my God, the thing is down. What are we gonna do? And these 3 a.m. hack sessions over, instant message to try to get the thing back working again. Well, now there are things like Google Fusion tables, there's tablesetter.js, there's Sheetsy. There are these very simple devices. At the Guardian, actually, we run almost everything off of Google spreadsheets. We do very little that involves servers and databases, and that's deliberate because keeping it simple is, arguably more important than that extra, 4 or 5 features, that you think you need that make it logarithmically more complex. But you can do a lot with a little now in ways that you couldn't before. And then I guess the last thing I would say is look in your own organization, but outside the newsroom. Some of the most amazing people I've worked with, had the privilege to work with, came from the technology side, the technology shop, the IT department, whatever you want to call it, of my own organization. So Jake Harris, who is the person who referred Jackie to me, came from the technology department. He was hired as a senior software architect and had a deep and abiding interest in working in the newsroom and doing, something with his coding skills that went beyond solving algorithmic problems and making the New York Times cookie crack a little bit faster, which is basically what he was doing when we first met. And those people are probably there. They're probably in your organization. And just a pro tip that I always like to say, when looking for those people, you might want to hold that up. Just hold that up real quick. Just go find somebody who's got a sticker on their computer. This is no, I'm serious. Or 12.
Yeah.
And if look for phrases like Open Knowledge Foundation. Serious. This is not a joke. I'm not kidding. Yeah, go look for the people who have that and then go talk to those people. And even a fourth one. There are so many meetups now. There are journo coders, but Hacks and Hackers has a zillion, quadrillion chapters all around the world. There are ways to get things done. And if you can get an editor excited about a project, and that project requires a little bit of coding or a lot of bit of coding, and you can show that editor, don't tell. You remember my favorite phrase, demos, not memos. This is Matt Waite, best phrase ever, demos, not memos. If you can show an editor and get that person excited about the project, you'd be amazed how they might have a little money tucked between a couple of cushions here or there to get somebody in freelance to work with you. And that's kind of the gateway. Once you start going down that road, believe me, then everybody in the newsroom gets excited about it, and then the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing. Oh, one more thing, sorry. And there's so much open source code. So many newsrooms are so good about this. ProPublica is amazing about this. They not only open source their code, they will tell you in great detail how they did what they did with code. The Night Lab at Northwestern University, their whole mission is building tools for journalists and giving the code away. And on and on and on and on, I'll shut up. But you get the idea. There's so much out there.
Got another question in the back there.
Hi, I'm Zara from, I work with School of Data from the Open Knowledge Foundation, so thanks for that.
You're welcome.
I was wondering if there's any link between the labels that you use to describe the unicorns and the success you've had with integrating them into the culture, because you've all used very different terms in talking about them: journo coders, hackers, civic hackers, technologists, interactive journalists. Are there any kind of common terms that seem to resonate a lot with journalists in newsrooms?
Editors?
Go, Jackie, go.
Well, I can take a pass at this if I may. I seem to remember a blog post that my then boss wrote about just the struggle, and I think it is a bit of a struggle to come up with a good title for someone who's in the newsroom and also doing technology. And I think you know, you've just named a series of different terms, and we could go on and on. I don't know if there are any that have been more successful across the board. I know that when I was at the New York Times, we tried sticking closer to the editorial sort of job titles. We also tried coming up with new ones that involve technology in some way. I don't know what it's like at the Journal.
Well, I think the end game for this is that we don't actually put kind of terms on people, and they just become part of the newsroom, and we don't have to describe them differently and kind of get all het up about it. You know, you have a picture editor, you have a journalist, I don't know, whatever, you know, we're probably not going to take the term unicorn and start, hey, you unicorn. We're not going to start running with that one, but I think, yeah, the end game is that they just become part of the team, and, you know, we don't stress out that much about it.
Other questions?
Hi, I have been asked to stand up. I'm not just stand up. I'm Alistair Reid from journalism.co.uk. To what degree, 50-50, 40-60, if that's an accurate way to look at it, is it a technological tools question or a mindset issue of approaching online digital journalism in an active, engaging way beyond just the kind of passive, what you read, what you watch, what you listen, that it used to be? Is it technical or mindset, and how does that come into it, would you say?
I think there's been a mindset change at the Journal in the last 18 months. You know, we actually did declare, like lots of other organisations, that we're going kind of digital first, but then you've kind of got to walk it as well as talk it. I feel that there's been a change. I think this new announcement last week that we're going to be bringing in, you know, a team of whatever you want to call it, into the newsroom will change things. How that's going to work, I don't know. But with speaking from our small team in London, you know, they are fully integrated now into our newsroom. So I think in terms of, you know, a cultural resistance thing, I think we've overcome that hump.
I mean, I definitely think that the mindset is more important. And I think it's really more about being open to collaboration, being open to not pigeonholing people. You know, a reporter, you know, I wouldn't say that every reporter needs to learn how to code, but if a reporter wants to learn how to code and wants to put together a graph, you should, you know, try to be receptive to that.
Other questions? Yep.
Yeah, hi, I'm Danya, I'm a student of journalism. How big is the work field for this? Like a general newsroom for average company, say how many of these actual unicorns would they be needing? Like how big is this workspace?
How many would they be? How many would they need? How many would they be needing? All of them, in my opinion. I mean, really, I don't know that there's. I don't know that there's a hard ceiling on it. And let's look at this from a bigger picture. I mean, we are all organizationally making this transition together, right? Where the mindset question isn't just, can we do better online graphics and interactives? It's, how do we approach these new media in ways that are, you know, smarter, better, and potentially can result in a better business model, a sustainable business model? And that's a big question, obviously. But the answer, which we do not know, but I can tell you this, it certainly involves more people who know how to make the internet, and not fewer. I think that's clear. So how big is the actual market right now? I really don't know. It's bigger, it's much bigger, orders of magnitude bigger than it was a decade ago, and I would guess that it's probably going to increase, you know, on the sort of logarithmic scale for the next 10 years, or until we're all out of business, I suppose. But you know, I can name, you know, I can't now name all of the teams in all the newsrooms in, let's just say, the U.S. I could have named all of them. In fact, I could have you know, itemize them on one hand 10 years ago, and that's changed a lot. So, you know, I don't know.
It's the biggest logjam in our newsroom at the moment, the fact that we don't have enough coders. You know, we go out and we say, hey, guys, look, we're doing all these groovy things, you know, come to us for ideas. And now at the moment, you know, they are kind of slightly overwhelmed. I think there's a cultural thing as well. Say we lose kind of an all markets reporter. That reporter is replaced immediately. Perhaps with the coders/unicorns that we have, there isn't that feeling that's come in yet that, look, we need to get a replacement in straight away. We need more people. And actually, there's one thing I forgot to mention about the mapping tool. At the Wall Street Journal, we have 2 cartographers, 2 print cartographers. I mean, what a luxury that is to have. But, you know, when we were kind of trying to build that tool, you know, I said to Elliot, you've got to speak to these cartographers and kind of get buy-in for that, because, you know, don't seek repentance after. There's some cases where, you know, you kind of just go and do it, and then you kind of take the crap afterwards. But in that case, we had buy-in from people. But I think that just shows we have 2 cartographers at the organisation, and, you know, there's an argument to be had. We need exponentially more coders than that. At the moment in London, we don't have. I know we are looking for more at the moment, and, you know, that is where we are going to be hiring people. That it's been identified as the crunch point where we need to hire.
Anybody else? Yep.
Hi, I'm Kodrina Ilie from School of Data, Open Knowledge too. Back to open source a little bit, you mentioned that you make a decision regarding what code becomes available, openly available. Coming from the open source community, I can truly say that any kind of code out there is a resource, either good or teaching me how not to do things. So how exactly do you make this decision? Is like there a board meeting saying this project could be continued, it could develop a small community, or what do you have something to tick, or what is the exact process? Thank you.
So, I mean, there's no big fancy, you know, board meeting or anything like that. I mean, generally speaking, it's sort of an instinctual thing, you know. Even the most rabid maybe the top, if you went to the 90 percentile, right, on the sort of open source spectrum, I think it would be safe to say that there is a decent amount of code written every day that just outside of that one application just really doesn't have a lot of value. And that's the stuff that we generally won't open source. But go look at the Guardian. I mean, darn near every keystroke that comes out of the broader technology team ends up on GitHub, and most of that ends up ultimately being open sourced. We've open sourced a bunch of stuff out of the interactive team just since I've been there. I think the math is pretty much kind of as you described. Does this code actually help somebody outside this organization solve a problem that we're all kind of faced with? And, you know, if so, then let's open source it and go from there, even if it's a tiny little thing or a library or something like that. But there's not an actual like tribunal or anything like that.
And I think that it often comes down to time. There's a certain responsibility in a way, I feel, at least, to putting code out there, like that you'll have at least some amount of documentation. And if you're writing code, perhaps on a deadline, you probably are not documenting it so perfectly, right? So sometimes it just comes down to time. I think, you know, when I was at the New York Times, for instance, like we might have open sourced more stuff if we had more time, like little tools and stuff.
For sure.
So, yeah. I also haven't been to a board meeting about open sourcing code.
Do we have some other questions? Yeah.
Hi, Finn from The Standard. Question to the editors mostly. What are your thoughts on, say you've been working on a feature on World War I for months. How do you launch it? How do you, I mean, as soon as you're done, it's basically in competition with your other 900 journalists who are working on stories. How do you launch it? Is it possible to stay on the front page for more than 24 hours? That's one of the questions I'm fighting right now.
Yeah, we thought quite a bit about how it was going to be launched. The anniversary of the 100th anniversary of the shooting of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was on June the 28th, and we got it out kind of a few days before. We were worried that a few other news organisations were going to be doing similar things, and they did, and I think they launched it early, but I think we made a call to launch it just as people were beginning to talk about it. We had a bit of marketing spend because, you know, we sold it to the editors. You know, they bought the project, they saw what it was like. You know, we thought very deeply about how it was going to be shared on social. As I said, each one of those things, you could kind of share one of those individually as well. So actually, you know, a lot of our traffic didn't just come to the homepage. It was people just sharing one item out, and that was the beauty of the 100 Legacies, was there was something there for everyone. You know, we basically made people keep it on the homepage, on the US homepage, for a long time. We said, look, we've put so much effort. It was kind of difficult for us because we were doing it from London. So we kind of had, the way that we got buy-in from New York was to get kind of New York editors involved. So, you know, we were editing 44,000 words, so we couldn't do that all on our own. So we got people in New York just to kind of give it the last look over. And, you know, I went over there and I spoke to people. And you know, I sold them the idea, but without the, you know, the backing of the homepage where they kept it up for quite a while, you know, it wouldn't have been the project what it was.
Yeah, so this is by far, without a doubt, no questions, the single most important thing that I spend my time worrying about. And it's arguably the most important question you can ask about a piece before you dive into
question.
it. Yeah, it's a fantastic question. No, and I spend, believe me, and so we have gone through, you know, Jackie's been involved in projects early on that we've built, we've loved like our own children, and then launched them, and it's crickets. You know, the homepage doesn't love it as much as we loved it, so it gets a little bit of attention, then it's gone, and traffic just flatlines. And so, you know, there's a few answers to that problem. One is, you'll see, at least in the time that I was running the team, we shifted. We started doing a lot of kind of standalone, monolithic destination interactives. And over time, we stopped doing those. Well, we didn't do as many. The bar to doing those was much higher than it used to be, because truly you would ask that question, well, we might love it, but does the homepage love it? And do readers really, really love it? And if the answer is, we're not sure, well, then you might want to rethink that strategy. And so a lot of the interactive thingamabobs that we would make, we would end up actually designing to go with articles, to be embedded into the article. So you're not in competition as much anymore. And you can do a surprising amount of interactivity in that space if you take over a piece of the article. And then we're doing the same kinds of things at the Guardian. The other thing that we thought about really hard is, okay, fine, how else, and John mentioned this, and this is really important, how else do people get to your content? What other audiences might they find? And a quick example is our interactive Oscars project. We used to do a ballot every year. And that ballot, what happened was, we did it one year, it did great, it was fine. Then the social media team joined the team I was running. I took over social media as well, and they took one look at it and said, oh, no. We're gonna have to do this over again. And they helped us redesign that whole thing basically around social, knowing that this thing is gonna travel best in social, because people wanna share themselves, not your page. And we did that and literally doubled our ballots year over year. And you would see during these 3 weeks when nobody cares about the Oscars, it's between the week of the Oscars themselves and the week that the nominations come out, we did like 10x more ballots submitted during those 3 weeks, just year over year. It was staggering. And the percentage coming from social. And then, by the way, the same thing happened when we made the ballot mobile friendly, when you could start actually doing a ballot on your phone. When we did that, we saw, again, an order of magnitude increase. And so we do a lot more that actually we have sort of social. We started thinking actually social is our sort of other front page. So we started doing a lot more that was sort of oriented to social, less so in competition. How do you convince your homepage? I mean, John answered it totally. You got to get them on board. You got to get the people who are going to make those decisions on board and make this part of the coverage and not sort of an additional third, fourth, fifth, or God forbid, sixth wheel, because then it's dead in the water. So, you know, a great example of that I had nothing to do with was, I think, the NSA Decoded project, which if you haven't seen it, you can Google the heck out of it. You'll find it. It's really beautiful. It's a beautiful combination of text and video and images and interactive, and it became the story. So Ewan McCaskill, who's the reporter on that, was totally bought in and was thrilled to be working, you know, a fairly old school journalist, but thrilled to be working on this project that ended up being this very kind of unique, I think, very innovative way of telling a story. And so ultimately those, you know, his 6,000 words became 4,000 words and a lot of video and a lot of interactive, but it became one piece. And that obviously did really, really well. So, I mean, this is, as I said, this is the thing that I could talk about this for an hour, I won't, but this is the thing that actually is one of the hardest problems that we face.
One other thing from the World War I example that I kind of touched upon as well, where we, you know, with all these lists where you kind of say with the top 100 things, the top 100 best guitar players, whatever, and you say, I can't believe, you know, you didn't have so-and-so on it. As I said, we turned it on its head and made a virtue of saying, what have we missed? And that kind of built up a conversation with our readers. We were thinking about doing hashtags and whatnot, and it was like, no, it's not going to bloody. We didn't think that was going to work. So actually, we started a kind of a conversation kind of with the reader. We also ran a quiz as well to kind of test yourself on kind of some of the knowledge. We had it actually checked by a historian just to make sure everything was right, and we got hundreds of responses from people. You know, some of that were not all that sensible, but we got some really good examples, and we ran five or six of them, and that conversational gambit actually worked for us.
It was just making me think about this sort of coming at my experiences in the startup side and a lot in technology for media, and I was thinking about this sort of lean startup methodology, the idea where you build a minimum viable product, you expose it to users, you gather feedback, and then you iterate, right? You build better and better versions of that. And I was thinking about it in the interactive teams. I imagine at the beginning it was kind of like spend 6 months building something and then release it, and crickets might happen, right? So how much of a role does experimentation play in the actual development of that final piece for you in The Guardian?
So for us, I think let's just go down the table. So for us, we do a lot of user testing. In fact, for elections, before we put a finger to a keyboard, we did about 2.5 months of intense UX work. We did focus groups, we did surveys. We wanted to know what people really wanted and what they valued. And you would think around something like an elections that the answers would be obvious and you just know. Well, it turns out actually we didn't just know. There were things we didn't do as a result of that. There are interactives we totally changed because of that research. That was really valuable. Yeah. We don't do as much, I would say, iterative. Journalism doesn't often lend itself to iteration, unfortunately. It's more of a big bang kind of an industry, unfortunately. So you can iterate around the edges. You can iterate around templates. You can iterate around ideas. You can iterate around interfaces and things like that. It's hard. It's not quite the same as launching a single product and then iterating.
Well, I'm part of a group called the News Lab, so you could say that's all we do is experiment, right? But I think it's really important to iterate and to take notice of what the response is, and make changes, given the caveats that Aaron just ran. One thing that I find pretty exciting about where I'm working now is that they just launched this platform called BBC Taster, And the whole idea of this platform, and it's not a labs or even necessarily R&D project, it's for the entire organization to try out new things, and it has analytics built into it with the idea of trying something out just quickly and then measuring how successful, which again is another panel, I guess, but just trying things out, and then if they're successful, to iterate on them and push them forward.
Yeah, we need to do more kind of UX work. We didn't do that for World War One. It was very small groups that we kind of tested with, basically journalistic colleagues. So that is something we can definitely learn from.
I think we'll take, by the way, I can't believe we made it to an hour and a half. I think we'll take one more question and then wrap it up. Yeah, go ahead.
I can believe
Hi, and I'm sorry for my English. Do you know how many unicorn are in Italy?
Should I just answer for us? No.
We know a few, a couple in this room even.
Maybe we could take one more question.
So, John, you said that sometimes you need to try out whether a story works or not. So, what did you learn from those stories that did not work?
That was going to be my closing question.
That we didn't UX it enough, probably. Yeah, with the example with the Premier League example was that we didn't go all the way back right to the start. It didn't work out as a kind of a 5-year kind of look back at kind of managerial results. I don't know really. It's kind of you've got to. You've just got to have a feel in your bones that something's going to work. I think with World War One, we just knew we were onto something special. With that, probably what we should have done with our Premier League thing was take it back to the drawing board. But there was kind of this momentum that was kind of moving forward so much. Basically, there was a host of managerial kind of changes, and the person who wasn't a coder who actually came up with the idea said we need to do it now. And there was reservations, and that kind of involuntary jerk that you get when you feel something's going wrong. You need to just be more aware of that than when that's happening.
Jackie, one thing that you've learned from some of the projects that you've done?
I think the most important lesson that I learned from doing projects, and it's one that I continue to learn, is to measure. I don't know, it's kind of a fine line between measuring the response that something you're trying is doing and figuring out if that means, if there isn't much of a response, does that mean that you should stop doing it, right? With news, that's a pretty tricky balance to achieve. But just trying to get that balance right, and I don't think there's ever just one answer to it.
Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned one thing. I think sort of related, just test, and that's not a guarantee of success either. By the way, I mean, you can do all the user testing in the world and think you've got it solved, and Silicon Valley is littered with dead startups that thought they had the perfect product and the market and everything else. So you will fail as often as you succeed, unfortunately. You just don't want your bosses to see the failures. So that's the key.
All right. John, Aaron, Jackie, thank you very much. And I think that's it. We can all go get a drink. Boom. 7. Boom. How the hell did you stretch it out? I don't know.